All right, we're doing another one of these. We're, once again, the point of this is to uphold the ancient tradition of oral poetry and, the type of oral poetry that would have been done in, the 8th century BC. So, as you can see, I'm not checking any reference. Everything comes off the top of my head, and, we'll piece together the elements. Let's keep going. The Lord Marshal continued through his host, inspiring the men and the leaders of the Argives. He ranged through every country and every nation. He came to Idomeneus, lord of Crete, that elder statesman of the Argive army. He saw the man preparing his men and giving faithful instruction, giving very wise and very strong battle tactics to his doughty fighters from that southward island. He said to him, "O great Idomeneus, it is not for nothing that you are honored most of all the Argives at feast and at table. You given the greatest and best cut of meat, and given always a refilled bowl of wine that is cut with less water than the others. For you are one of the bulwarks of the Achaeans. You can always be counted on in battle and in council." Idomeneus flushed at this and was glad. He said, "Agamemnon, I am willing to fight and kill and die for you if needed, as are all the men here. We support you in this endeavor entirely. Now, while I continue to bring forth my men, go visit the other captains who may need your help more than I, for my heart is already fully in this fight." Hearing this, Agamemnon went forth to that great charioteer Gerenian Nestor, horse lord of fertile Pylos, sandy and good. Nestor, the great counselor who had lived through 3 generations of men, ruling over them and offering his wisdom. The man who could see throughout the past ages all the way into that time of heroes when Theseus and Heracles roamed the earth. Nestor was offering his men very good strategy, and Agamemnon overheard as he approached that area of the battlefield. Nestor spoke, "Men, when you are out on that battlefield, I want to see you taking your spears in your hands as you are in your chariot. Do not throw the spear, but rather stab forth from your chariot. Therefore you can keep your weapon and you can continuously attack without as much risk to your bodily self. This is how it was done in the old days with those bronze-armored great ones and those godly heroes of old. I want to see as well that all the fighters who have the lesser courage, no shame in it, everyone has his portion of courage and valor given to him by the great son of Kronos. But if you feel you may be flagging, you shall go to the center of the host, and all those bravest with the most commendations from the fight shall go on the outside. Therefore none will flee, none will be feeling that pull to leave the battlefield, which always breaks up and destroys a host when someone is to break their battle lines. Such a formation will allow it so that even if your heart flags. You will not be able to leave and shame yourself and put your fellow men in danger." Thus all the men cheered at this, for even those who were cowards could feel that they contribute to the entire army's cause. Nestor, that great counselor, stood watching over his army, giving small instructions to his heralds and his captains. And he, Agamemnon, came up to that Gerenian horseman, and he said, "Oh, wise Nestor, if only we had 10 of your like in the army, then we would surely have taken that gated city of Troy already. Such as your like comes but once in a generation. Oh, if only you had youth along with wisdom, that you would be able to serve in the front lines with all of us other captains, that you would be not forced to stand behind. The gods are cruel, they are, that they give out a portion of such wisdom to a man who is not able himself to be fighting at his fittest in a time of need." Nestor heard him and was glad at the compliments, but he said, "O great Agamemnon, I have stood and watched and counseled over many a generation, and the gods do not portion out all things at once. It would not be meet for them to do so. But as such, one cannot gain wisdom without having spent many a year in seeing and in doing and in trying and failing and trying again. Thus, with those years only can such strong counsel come. Therefore, yes, I do wish that I had that body that I once had when I competed in the funeral games of Peleus, that uncle of Jason, the great captain of Argo. But it is not to be. I have been given this body in exchange for all the things I have learned to attain it. And now I will transfer that knowledge to all who I can, so that the entire host will have every tool at their disposal to take down this hated city of the Trojans and Phrygians." Agamemnon was overjoyed, and he promised Nestor many great gifts once they have taken the city of Troy, above and beyond his normal share of loot. Thus Agamemnon saw his army, and spoke to them, and offered encouragement and chiding and motivation where needed. He ranged back to his Mycenaeans and told them of their orders in the battle lines. And thus was the Achaean host ready to set forth. That would be a long day indeed, when many a Trojan and Achaean would lay in the dust together, churning up the red mire until the hot earth steamed with boiling blood. All right, not so bad. Oh, you can see my bed in the background there. I always end up tilting the camera up when I do these blindfolded things. I don't know why. I think that was pretty good. I got a lot of details in there. Nestor always has a really long speech about some very specific, anecdote from his past life, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get all that, but I did get in a little bit of details from Peleus's funeral games, which was nice. I thought it was a really interesting thing where Nestor, in the story, he's using the thing where he puts the cowards in the middle of his battle formation as more of like a punishment, like, making sure these guys who we know are cowards will not escape. But, or at least that's the tone that it seems like. But in this one, I felt like it was a pretty good addition that I made, where he actually is inspiring the men. I was inspired by the moment in the Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, the book, when they're approaching Mordor, and then there's like a section of the army of Aragorn's like final force approaching Mordor that's like overcome with fear, and they have to leave. Like he says, like, you can go home, but he gives them like a mission to defend a particular area, which makes them feel like they're still useful and like they haven't failed their country, which is, in my opinion, probably one of the most impressive moments of seeing him as an actual leader of men and not just like a hero of single combat or like fighting battles, because it truly inspires the guys. And I thought that Nestor doing something like that would be pretty interesting because he's supposed to be such a strong counselor. So out of all the additions I've made to my version, you know, whatever you call this, like living version of the story so far, I think that's one of the strongest that I've come up with. I would like to expand on that if I return to this. I thought that was good. Who else did we talk about? Idomeneus was pretty straightforward. Not so much new stuff in there from the story, original story. Who else was in there? Was it just Idomeneus and Nestor that he talked to? Maybe it was. I thought that was pretty good though. Nestor also has an interesting part where he talks about stabbing from the chariots, which you actually never see. That's, you know, archaeologists and scholars say that that's a strategy that was used in the actual Bronze Age when the Iliad would have taken place, but that nobody in the story really does it. They all throw their spears in combat. And it's one of the examples of how Homer is kind of like stitching together elements of stories that came from different eras. So for example, it's kind of like how he's basically putting together like an Avengers of characters, and some of them were invented before others. Like Ajax, a lot of people think is from an era that would have been even earlier than everybody else, and that he wasn't originally in the Iliad story because of his tower shield and a lot of the elements of his character. And then, yeah, the way Nestor chooses to fight and certain other elements too. It's kind of like this hodgepodge of different eras. And that's why I think that Christopher Logue's war music, which is like his version of the Iliad, and then it still takes place in the Bronze Age, but it has like weird fantasy elements where like Hector's 8 feet tall, but it's not like fantasy. But then it also has like anecdotes where like the narrator will sometimes mention an anecdote of like being in Vietnam or something, but it still takes place in the Bronze Age. And then sometimes those little things will like creep in almost like a mistake, which brings it into sharper relief that that's actually what Homer was doing at the time, because he was giving, a lot of times he gives anecdotes that are only true of the classical, not classical era, but of his era, like the geometric age, the 8th century BC, which would not have occurred in the time the story would have been taking place, which was like 400 or 500 years before that. So yeah, all of that to say, I'm glad that I got that little moment in from Nestor. And I would like to explore more stuff like that. That was just one that was actually in the story, but to try and mishmash together more stuff. Like in the game that we're doing, the aesthetic is of Attic red figure pottery of the classical age, 500 years after Homer. And what it's depicting is the Iliad, which takes place in like 1200 BC, but the pottery would have been made in like 300 or 400 BC. So there's a huge gap of time. And the armor that we're doing is all of the classical era. So there's like the plumed Corinthian helmets and the, linothoraxes and stuff, that's what you think of when you think of a Greek soldier, but that's actually not what they would have looked like in the time of the Iliad. In that, it would have looked closer to, in game terms, the Troy Total War game does a really good job of showing actual Bronze Age armor designs, which I incorporate a couple of from some of the reference books I have into the game as well. But I figure that in the spirit of how Homer is jumping eras like that, because most of the art that comes down to us depicting the Iliad is on red figure pottery, and on that pottery they're always depicted as what were then contemporary soldiers, you know, fighting in like the Persian war, the war against Persia, or the you know, wars of Athens and Sparta and stuff, where they're hoplites and stuff, but they're Trojan warriors depicted as hoplites. So I figure that that's what we're doing, is like, it's as if we are in the 4th century BC depicting Trojan and Achaean warriors as hoplites. And then so that sort of like the 3 different times that you have to keep in mind for the story is very interesting. I think we can do a lot of interesting stuff with that if I ever am able to figure out, you know, right now I'm just struggling to kind of like get the story out, but hopefully, you know, once I get to the end of one telling of the Iliad and I come back and I would remember which parts I already, you know, came up with, hopefully, then I would be able to more easily sort of like embellish and add more pieces that I want. Again, not very good at it yet, any of it, but it's getting a little smoother every time, and feeling a little more confident every time, so happy about that. Let's keep going with it.